Under the dim glow of a kerosene lamp, the hum of a sewing machine became the pulse of the night. The barracks smelled of wet canvas and salt air, and the sound of waves beyond the wire fence was both lullaby and taunt. Miyako Tanaka leaned into her work, her dark hair falling like a curtain over her face as she patched a khaki sleeve. The uniform did not belong to her, nor to anyone she loved, but she stitched it as though the threads held the fragile seam between chaos and order. The fabric was stiff, smelling of sweat and iron, yet under her hands it became softer, obedient, whole again. Each push of the needle was an act of quiet defiance. They had taken her name, given her a number, but they could not take the dignity of a perfectly mended seam. Outside, sentries paced. Their boots struck the earth with a rhythm that had become the soundtrack of her captivity. Sand Island was not the worst of the camps. There were no blizzards here, no desert winds, but the sea surrounding it made escape impossible. By day, the prisoners worked in silence. By night, they tried to remember who they had been before the wire. Miyako, at 26, had once been the most promising calligraphy teacher in her Honolulu district. She had a gift for taking the rigid brushstrokes of kanji and making them flow like music. Her students had said she could make even a single character for heart feel like a beating one. But December 7, 1941, had split that heart clean in two. The morning after the attack, she was taken from her home, accused of suspicious correspondence with family in Osaka, and sent here without trial. It was during one of her mending shifts that she first saw him. Colonel James Whitfield entered the barracks with a clipboard tucked under his arm, his pressed uniform incongruous against the peeling walls. He had the air of a man who believed in order, in the neat arrangement of facts and lives, but his gray eyes betrayed something restless, an unease at the sight before him. The prisoners rose automatically, bowing slightly as if to prove their good behavior, but Miyako did not stop sewing. Not out of defiance, but because the fabric in her hand was almost finished, and to stop now would feel like leaving a wound half closed. Whitfield's boots clicked across the concrete. He scanned the room, ticking boxes on his clipboard, until his gaze caught on the single woman who had not risen. Her hands worked quickly, and only when the last knot was tied did she look up, her expression calm, almost curious. There was no apology in her eyes, no plea. Instead, there was something else, something that startled him more than anger might have. Dignity. As though she were not the prisoner, and he not the man with the power to decide her fate. The colonel nodded once, an almost imperceptible gesture, before leaving as abruptly as he had arrived. But that night, when Miyako lay on her cot staring at the slats of the ceiling, she found herself thinking not of freedom, but of those gray eyes. The days that followed were a blur of routine, but the memory of the man with the clipboard lingered like the afterimage of a flash. She told herself it was foolishness, a distraction, yet when he returned a week later for another inspection, she noticed her heartbeat quicken. He asked her name, and when she answered softly, "Tanaka, Miyako," his pencil hesitated on the page as if reluctant to reduce her to ink and paper. After that day, he came more often. Officially, he said, he was tasked with improving camp conditions. Unofficially, he lingered near her sewing table, asking questions that had little to do with security. What poems did she teach her students? How long had she been in Honolulu? Did she miss Osaka's cherry blossoms? His voice was measured, but there was a warmth there she had not expected from a man in uniform. Miyako answered cautiously at first, then more freely. She told him about her grandmother, about the scent of persimmons drying in autumn, about the loneliness that clung to her like a second skin. Whitfield listened with the stillness of a man who had been trained to hear gunfire at a mile's distance, yet was now straining to catch the sound of a woman's laughter. Once, when she spoke of the night sky over Osaka, he smiled faintly and said, "Sounds like you've seen stars I've never seen." The remark was simple, but it landed like a stone in a still pond, rippling through her thoughts long after he left. And so a strange rhythm took root. He would appear, she would pretend not to wait for him, and the barracks would become a place where words, not just orders, were exchanged. The other detainees noticed, of course. Some teased her gently. Others warned her to be careful, that a man like that could not be trusted. She nodded, said nothing, and returned to her sewing. But one evening, when a storm blew in from the sea and rain drummed on the tin roof like impatient fingers, she found herself watching the door more than her work. When Whitfield entered, shaking water from his cap, their eyes met and held. For a heartbeat, the war outside seemed to vanish, leaving only the sound of rain and the electric thrum of something unspoken. It was then that Miyako felt the first real shift in her captivity. Not freedom. No, the wire still stood, the guards still marched, but a crack had opened somewhere in the wall she had built around herself. And through that crack, something warm and dangerous was seeping in. She told herself it meant nothing, that this was merely curiosity, but when Whitfield turned to leave, she felt an ache as if he were taking a piece of the lamplight with him. That night, sleep would not come. She lay awake listening to the surf, replaying their brief conversation until it felt like a secret she might one day be punished for. And when the first light of dawn crept across the barracks floor, she rose not with the heavy resignation of a prisoner, but with the sharp, almost guilty sense that the world was tilting toward something new. She could not name it yet, could not even admit it to herself. But deep down she knew. The needle had pierced the fabric, and there was no unthreading what had begun. The island of Oahu had always been a paradox. Lush hillsides dripping with hibiscus, seashell-colored sand stretching like a dream, and now, machine-gun nests staring seaward as though paradise itself had become suspicious. Honolulu in wartime was a city under curfew, its street lamps hooded, its people watched. The sound of swing music from hotel ballrooms clashed with the clatter of military convoys, creating a rhythm that never let its inhabitants forget they were living at the edge of something volatile. For the Japanese community, each day carried a weight heavier than the humid air. Shop signs in kanji were painted over, neighbors disappeared overnight, and whispered rumors spread like wildfire. Who had been questioned, who had been taken, who might be next. Miyako carried these fears like stones in her pocket. Every trip to the communal showers, every walk to the mess hall, was a gauntlet of glances and questions, some sympathetic, others suspicious. She was polite but guarded, bowing her head when guards passed, keeping her voice low when others discussed rumors of spies and saboteurs. The war had turned her into both ghost and witness, present yet not fully seen. Her world had narrowed to a rectangle of sky framed by barbed wire, and it might have stayed that way if not for the Colonel's persistent shadow at the edge of her days. James Whitfield was not a man who allowed himself softness easily. He had served in France during the First World War, learned early how to read the landscape of fear in a man's eyes, and had since built his life around order and discipline. But Miyako disrupted him in ways he could not put to paper. He found himself inventing reasons to be near the barracks, offering new sewing supplies, inspecting conditions that did not require his presence. Each time, he told himself he was fulfilling his duty, checking morale, gathering data. But when he caught himself memorizing the exact shade of her eyes, he knew duty was no longer the only reason he returned. Their conversations lengthened, gaining color and contour like a painting with each new layer. He asked about her calligraphy lessons, and she explained the patience required to master a single brushstroke. He shared how his father had been a schoolteacher in Ohio, how books had been his first escape from the drabness of farm life. Their words built a bridge of small, shared truths, fragile, but strong enough to bear the weight of the silence that followed. Around them, the camp seemed to fade, leaving only the intimate space carved out by their voices. One afternoon, while the sun burned white overhead and the prisoners lined up for roll call, a commotion near the gate drew everyone's attention. A detainee had tried to escape, slipping into the shallows and swimming toward the channel before being caught by patrolling guards. The man was dragged back, coughing seawater, his face a mask of despair. Whitfield stood by as the man was reprimanded, his jaw tight, his eyes unreadable. Miyako watched him from across the yard, her heart beating hard. Later, as she sat by the sewing table, Whitfield approached. "It isn't right," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "That man will be transferred, and it will break his family apart." "War breaks everything apart," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "But perhaps it is better to stay broken than to pretend there is no damage." He looked at her then, as though she had said something dangerous, something he had been afraid to name. That night, he wrote in his journal, "I came here to enforce the rules, and now I find myself questioning the fence itself." Their bond deepened in the shadow of that fence. Small gestures became lifelines. A book smuggled into the barracks, a shared cup of coffee on a rain-soaked afternoon. Whitfield found himself confiding things he had never told anyone. How he still dreamed of the trenches in France, how he sometimes woke with the metallic taste of fear in his mouth. Miyako listened without judgment, and in return, she told him how the smell of the ocean reminded her of Osaka's harbors, how she wrote poems in her head at night to keep from forgetting her language. But the war pressed in on them, relentless and unsparing. Honolulu buzzed with rumors of Japanese submarines off the coast, of enemy sympathizers hiding in plain sight. The FBI tightened its surveillance, and the camp grew tense. One evening, Miyako overheard two guards speaking in low voices. They were compiling lists, deciding which detainees might be transferred to the mainland for heightened scrutiny. Her name, she learned, was on that list. The knowledge struck like a physical blow. Transfer meant being sent far from Honolulu, perhaps to the mainland camps in the desert, where the heat could kill the spirit as surely as the isolation. That night, when Whitfield came by under the pretext of inspecting supplies, she told him. For the first time since she had met him, he swore under his breath. "I'll fight it," he said. "I can write to the provost marshal, argue that you are not a threat." "Argue?" she said with a small, bitter laugh. "I am already guilty in their eyes. I have the wrong face, the wrong name." He did not flinch, but there was something raw in his expression as he answered. "Not to me." Those 3 words sank deep, as if they had been waiting all this time to be spoken aloud. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. And then, as if on cue, the camp's generator sputtered and the lights went out, plunging the barracks into darkness. Somewhere outside, a guard cursed, a flashlight beam swung wildly. In the sudden hush, Miyako felt his presence beside her, close enough that she could hear his breathing. When the lights returned, nothing had changed outwardly. The wire still gleamed, the guards still patrolled. But inside her, something had shifted. She was no longer simply a prisoner counting the days. There was now a thread pulling her forward, invisible yet unbreakable, and it was tied to the man who had just promised to fight for her. In the weeks that followed, she noticed him more keenly. The way his shoulders stiffened when headquarters sent new orders, the quiet fury in his hands when he wrote reports he clearly despised. Their conversations grew bolder, moving from weather and poetry to questions of loyalty, justice, and what it meant to belong to a country that did not trust you. She began to feel as though they were standing on opposite sides of the same locked gate, reaching through the bars to grasp each other's hands. Then, one humid morning, word spread that Colonel Whitfield had been summoned to a classified briefing in Honolulu proper. He left without a word, and for 3 long days, Miyako saw no sign of him. On the 4th day, as the sun sank into the ocean and painted the barracks in blood-orange light, he returned. His face was grave, his steps measured, as though he carried a weight heavier than his own body. When he reached her sewing table, he set his cap down and said, "I have something to ask of you, but it may change everything." The barracks seemed to fall silent at that moment, the air thick with the smell of salt and oil, the sound of waves suddenly distant. Miyako felt her hands still, the needle frozen mid-stitch. Whatever words were about to leave his mouth, she sensed, would carry the power to alter the course of her life more than the barbed wire ever had. The dusk had barely settled when Whitfield spoke, his voice low, as if even the wind might carry the words where they did not belong. Miyako watched him carefully, her fingers still resting on the patch of fabric she had been working moments before. He looked different, older somehow, as though the briefing he had attended had carved new lines into his face. "There's a situation," he said at last, choosing each word like a man laying stones across a fast river. "And I think you're the one who can help me fix it." She did not answer right away. The phrase was too neat, too American. Fix it, as if a single action could straighten what war had splintered. He reached into his coat and produced a slim folder, worn at the edges, smelling faintly of tobacco. Inside were names, dates, addresses, residents of Honolulu's Japanese neighborhoods, some known to her, others strangers. He laid it before her like an offering. There are rumors of coded messages, money changing hands, someone passing information to submarines offshore. We've had informants, but they're useless. Most don't speak the language or know the streets. You could. The room seemed to tilt under her feet. The absurdity of it almost made her laugh, almost. Here was the U.S. Army, which had arrested her as a threat, now asking her to become their eyes and ears. She slid the folder back toward him with 2 fingers. "You already have my freedom," she said quietly. "You want my conscience, too?" He did not flinch. "I want the truth. And I trust you to find it." The word trust landed with startling force. No one had trusted her since the war began. Trust had become a currency rarer than sugar, scarcer even than rice. For a long moment she said nothing, and in that silence, the statistics of their world loomed like silent witnesses. More than 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry had been removed from their homes across America, less than 5% ever accused of anything, yet nearly all were still behind wire. Entire families lived in horse stalls, desert shacks, warehouses, classified as dangerous because of their blood. And now here was a colonel, asking her to cross the invisible line between captive and collaborator. Whitfield's jaw worked as though grinding down words before releasing them. If we don't get good intelligence, the brass will round up more people. Maybe everyone in the district. I can't stop that. But if we can prove who's innocent, who's guilty, we can save lives. The sincerity in his voice was like a hairline crack in a frozen lake, subtle, but deepening fast. Miyako looked down at her hands. They were steady, which surprised her. And if I refuse, she asked. Then you stay here, he said, gesturing toward the barracks, the fences, the guards pacing like clockwork figures. You wait until they ship you to Topaz or Poston or God knows where. And nothing changes. She should have been angry, should have thrown the folder back at him. But instead she felt a hollow laughter building in her chest. Do you know what we say in camp? She murmured. We say the barbed wire keeps the war out. But really, it keeps us from touching it. Something flickered in his eyes then, not pity, but something sharper. He leaned in just enough that she caught the faint smell of rain on his jacket. You told me once that this place is where people wait to be remembered human. This is how you remind them. The barracks door opened then, letting in a gust of night air and the sound of distant ocean surf. For a moment neither moved. She thought of the old men who sat on their cots staring at nothing, the mothers who braided their children's hair with hands that trembled. Perhaps she had been waiting, too, waiting for a way to act, to matter again. Still, she could not let him see her decision so easily. Give me time, she said, rising from the bench. If you expect me to risk what little I have left, I will do it on my own terms. For 3 days she avoided him. She spent the hours sweeping the barracks, teaching a boy to fold cranes from ration wrappers, memorizing the names on the folder in her mind. She did not sleep much. When she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of those who might be saved and those who might be condemned by her word. The choice was a blade balanced on its point, and she was the one meant to tip it. On the 4th night, a storm rolled over the island. The sky cracked open, releasing rain that drummed against the tin roof and pooled in the sandy yard. She stepped outside barefoot, letting the water soak through her thin dress. And there, on the other side of the fence, stood Whitfield, his hat gone, his hair plastered to his skull. He said nothing, perhaps knowing words might shatter what courage she had gathered. But when their eyes met through the curtain of rain, she felt the decision settle inside her like a stone dropped into deep water. She walked toward him, each step sinking slightly in the mud. When she reached the fence, she gripped the cold wire and said, I'll do it, but not for your war. Her voice rose just enough to be heard over the rain. For mine. A strange relief passed over his face, though he did not smile. He reached through the fence, his gloved hand brushing hers for the briefest moment. It was not tenderness exactly. It was an oath silent but binding. After that night, preparations moved quickly. She was given civilian clothes, a small stipend, and a list of contacts. He explained the procedures in clipped tones, where to report, whom to avoid, how to send coded messages through innocuous letters. Miyako listened, committing each instruction to memory, though inwardly she marveled at the absurdity of it all. Only months ago, she had been interrogated for writing to her grandmother. Now the army wanted her to write with purpose, to slip meaning between the lines. When she was finally cleared to leave the camp, she packed her few possessions: a brush, a small book of poems, a shawl her mother had given her years ago. As she stepped through the gates, she paused, feeling the eyes of the guards on her back. She was still a prisoner, though now her cage had widened to the size of the city. Before she departed, Whitfield found her near the transport truck. You understand the risk, he said. If this goes wrong— I know, she interrupted, not unkindly. If this goes wrong, there will be no grave for me to visit. He nodded once, as though she had passed some private test. The truck engine coughed to life, drowning out the sounds of the camp. As it rumbled forward, Miyako looked over her shoulder one last time. Whitfield stood where she had left him, rainwater still darkening the shoulders of his coat, watching until she vanished into the night. She pressed the folder of names against her chest, feeling the weight of it, not just paper and ink, but lives. And somewhere deep within her, a quiet, dangerous thought bloomed. She had just agreed to fight a war of her own making, and there was no turning back. The first breath of freedom tasted like salt and diesel. The truck deposited her at the edge of Honolulu's Chinatown, its streets glistening from the morning rain, the smell of fish markets mingling with the sharper tang of kerosene lamps. For a moment she stood still, her hands clenched at her sides, overwhelmed by the noise. Vendors calling out prices in Cantonese, soldiers laughing as they strode past, a radio crackling a swing tune from an open window. After years of confinement, the world seemed too large, too loud, as though she had stepped into a stage play where every detail had been painted too vividly. She began her mission the way Whitfield had instructed, small, deliberate steps that would draw no attention. She visited shops whose owners she had once known, speaking in polite tones, asking careful questions. She took tea with widows who still hung pictures of the emperor in their living rooms and listened to their fears. The work was delicate, a balancing act between curiosity and caution. Every conversation felt like walking a tightrope over a chasm. One wrong word, and she could tumble into suspicion from either side. Each night, she wrote her reports by lamplight, folding them into coded letters disguised as mundane correspondence. She learned to slip meaning into the curve of a sentence, to hide warnings inside casual remarks about the weather or the price of rice. It was a strange power, terrifying, intoxicating, and with each letter she felt herself stepping further away from the girl who had once sat quietly sewing in the barracks. Yet freedom was not simple. Everywhere she went, she felt eyes on her back. Some of her own community avoided her, suspecting she had made some arrangement to earn her release. Once, in the marketplace, a man she had known since childhood turned away sharply, muttering that she had chosen the wrong side. The words stung more than she expected, and that night she burned her shawl in the courtyard of her boarding house, as though shedding the last fragment of who she had been. Whitfield met her in secret, usually in the back room of a shuttered warehouse near the harbor. Their meetings were brief, brisk, but threaded with a current neither dared name. He would read her reports, nod grimly, and pass along new instructions. Sometimes, when the work was done, they would sit in silence, the air between them charged, the smell of salt water and machine oil wrapping around them like another presence. "You've saved 3 men from transfer," he told her once, his voice quiet but fierce. "Your information cleared them. Their families will stay here." The word struck her like an unexpected gust of wind. For all her doubt, for all the nights she lay awake wondering if she had betrayed her people, here was proof that her work mattered. She was not simply gathering gossip for a foreign power. She was saving lives, one report at a time. But the danger grew with each success. One evening, after leaving a tea house where she had spoken to a shopkeeper's wife, Miyako realized she was being followed. The sound of footsteps behind her was unmistakable, slow and deliberate. Her heart leapt into her throat. She turned down an alley, the puddles reflecting the yellow glow of lanterns, her steps quickening. The figure followed, closing the distance. When she emerged onto a main street, she ducked into a crowd of sailors spilling out of a bar, using their rowdy laughter as cover. When she finally reached her boarding house, breathless and shaking, she locked the door and pressed her back against it until the trembling stopped. The next time she saw Whitfield, she told him. His expression darkened. "You need to be careful," he said, though his voice carried an edge of frustration that betrayed how little control he truly had. "I can request protection." "No," she interrupted. "If I am seen with soldiers, no one will speak to me again. The work will die." He looked at her then, long enough that she had to turn away. She could feel the weight of his gaze, the war inside him between duty and something else. Weeks passed, and Honolulu became both prison and battlefield, its sunlit streets layered with invisible tension. Miyako learned to read faces like maps, to sense danger in the set of a jaw or the sudden hush of a room. She was no longer merely surviving. She was acting, choosing, shaping the course of events. And yet, with each choice, the distance between the life she had known and the life she now lived grew wider. One humid afternoon, she found herself standing at the edge of the ocean, the surf lapping at her ankles. Children played nearby, shrieking with laughter, their joy oblivious to war or wire. For the first time, she wondered what she would do when the fighting ended, if it ever did. Would she return to teaching, to brush and ink? Or would she forever be this in-between creature? Neither prisoner nor free, neither wholly trusted nor entirely belonging? The next report she delivered contained something new. Confirmation of a small extortion ring operating in the district, exploiting farmers by threatening to report them as collaborators unless they paid. Whitfield read it, his jaw tight. "We can stop this," he said. "You've just given me what we need." That night, as she walked back through the streets, she felt an unfamiliar swell of pride. She had not merely informed, she had struck a blow against injustice. The thought made her chest ache in a way that was both painful and exhilarating. But the more effective she became, the more dangerous her work grew. Rumors circulated of an informant who was too precise, too effective. Some said there must be a traitor among them. One evening, a rock was thrown through the window of her boarding house room, shattering the glass. Tied to it was a scrap of paper with a single word written in Japanese, Yurigishi. Turncoat. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the word until her vision blurred. Her hands, which had once been so steady with brush and needle, now shook. She thought of Whitfield, of the trust that had passed silently between them through wire and rain and whispered meetings. She thought of the families she had saved, the men she had condemned. For the first time, she wondered if she would survive this mission, not because of the army, but because of her own people. The following morning, she rose before dawn and dressed in silence. When she stepped into the street, the sky was just beginning to pale, and a breeze carried the smell of the sea. She knew she would have to meet Whitfield that evening to deliver her next report, but this time, it would not just be information she handed over. Tonight, she would tell him what she had seen in the alley, what had been written on the note, and she would demand to know whether the work they were doing was worth the blood it was beginning to cost her. And as she walked toward the awakening city, she felt the question forming like a storm on her tongue, one that might end their mission or change it forever. The sky over Honolulu was a sheet of hammered gold the evening the war ended. News had spread like a pulse through the streets. Japan had surrendered. The city erupted, bells rang, sailors embraced strangers, children ran barefoot through the puddles left by the day's rain. Yet Miyako stood apart, her back pressed against the rough wood of a telephone pole, her hands clasped as if in prayer. The words should have been liberating, "It's over," but they felt strangely hollow, like an echo inside a room that had already been emptied. She had been carrying her final report under her arm all day, the envelope damp with sweat, its contents as sharp as a blade. It contained the names of the last few collaborators she had confirmed, and a note identifying the farmers who had been falsely accused. This was the report that would close the mission, perhaps even close her part in the war. But the victory that surged through the city felt far away from her, like music heard from behind glass. When Whitfield arrived, his coat slung over one arm, his face was pale with exhaustion. He had spent the day in meetings, overseeing troop movements, ensuring security in case of riots or retaliation. And yet when he saw her, a flicker of relief passed through him, as though she were the one steady point in a world that had just tipped on its axis. "It's done," he said simply. "The war is over." She nodded but did not smile. Instead, she handed him the envelope. He did not open it immediately. For a long moment they stood together on the edge of the harbor, the wind carrying the smell of salt and engine grease. "You should know," he said finally, "that what you've done here saved dozens of lives. Maybe more. And condemned others," she answered softly. He did not deny it. "War does not give us clean choices," he said. "But you gave us better ones." The words settled heavily between them. For months she had been walking a line that cut her in two, choosing each step carefully, fearing it might be her last. And now, with the war over, she expected to feel whole again. But instead she felt strangely hollow, like a vessel that had been poured out. They walked together through the city as dusk deepened, the celebration roaring around them. Jubilant shouts, music pouring from radios, the crackle of fireworks blooming over the harbor. Miyako kept her eyes forward, the glow of each firework reflected in her dark irises, as if the sky itself were writing something only she could read. At the far end of the pier, they stopped. The sea stretched out before them, calm and dark, as though it had been waiting for this moment too. Whitfield turned to her, his expression unguarded for once, stripped of the discipline that had kept him steady all this time. "I'm being reassigned," he said. "Stateside. They want me to help with demobilization." The word struck her like a sudden gust of wind, stealing her breath. She had known, of course, that this moment would come, that their strange, impossible partnership could not last forever. But hearing it aloud was a wound she had not prepared for. "And me?" she asked. "You're free," he said, and the word landed like both gift and curse. Free. Free to walk the streets, free to teach again, free to leave this chapter behind. Free to never see him again. For a moment neither spoke. Then Whitfield reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook, the same one he had carried since the first day she had seen him in the barracks. He tore out a single page and handed it to her. On it was a line from his journal, written in his precise hand. When she walked into my office, it felt like sunlight entering a cave. Miyako traced the words with her fingertips, her throat tightening. She had not expected this quiet confession, this offering of something unmilitary, unarmored. "You changed me," he said, his voice low. "You made me see the people I was guarding not as a problem to be managed, but as lives worth fighting for. I don't know how to thank you for that." "You don't have to," she whispered. "You saw me. That was enough." The wind lifted then, carrying the smell of plumeria blossoms from somewhere inland. She closed her eyes and let it wash over her, imagining for a moment that it could carry away everything. The fear, the wire, the sound of boots striking earth at night. When she opened them again, he was still watching her, as though trying to memorize her face. "Will you stay?" he asked softly. She shook her head, not in refusal but in something quieter. "I think I must. There are still children who need to learn to write their names. And cherry trees waiting to be painted." A faint, almost rueful smile touched his mouth. "Then you'll mend what's been torn." It was not a question, and she did not answer aloud. But as they stood together in the deepening twilight, she felt the truth of it settle into her bones. She had spent the war stitching together scraps of information, lives, loyalties. And now it was time to stitch herself back into the world. When the time came for him to leave, they did not embrace. Instead, he took her hand, holding it firmly, as though passing something invisible between them. It lasted only a moment, but it felt like an eternity compressed into a single gesture. Then he turned and walked away, his figure swallowed by the glow of the street lamps, leaving her standing at the edge of the pier. Miyako stayed there long after he had gone, watching the harbor lights shimmer on the water. The city roared behind her, but she heard only the sound of waves against the pilings, steady and endless. She thought of the first time she had seen him, clipboard in hand, his eyes catching hers across the barracks. It seemed a lifetime ago, yet the thread between those two moments was unbroken. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small needle she had kept hidden all this time, the same one she had used to mend uniforms in the camp. Holding it up to the moonlight, she smiled faintly. The war had been a tear through the fabric of her life, jagged and merciless. But now, she thought, it was her turn to stitch it closed. When she finally turned to go, the sky exploded with another round of fireworks, red and white flaring across the horizon. For the first time, she let herself smile, not in celebration of victory, but in recognition of survival. And as the echoes faded, she felt certain that somewhere far away, Whitfield was looking at the same sky, carrying the same unspoken vow. That they had not only endured the war, but had become something more because of it. Which city are you watching our video from? For more powerful stories from World War II, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you.